Admins of you know, like these pesky users that always ask for like, oh, could you please consent to my nice cloud app? Oh, guess what? Some of them are malicious, and Zapier and Chara will tell us exactly how malicious they are and how many they found.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. We are really excited to be here. Today we're going to talk about OAuth applications in Azure. We start with explaining what they are and how they work. Then we'll explain how attackers are abusing them. And finally, we'll talk about detections and what defenders should monitor. But before we get started, a quick introduction. My name is Shahar Dorfman. I live in Israel, and I'm a threat researcher at Wiz. This is my first time speaking at Troopers, so I'm really excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Sapir. I'm also a threat researcher at Wiz. This is my third time I'm speaking at Troopers, and I'm more nervous than ever. If you know me, you know that Troopers is my favorite conference. So thank you so much for the Troopers people that having me here once again. So a quick story. In the year of 2019, many people stumbled upon this exact screenshot, and they clicked accept. Now, I want you to raise your hand if you think you would have read this whole prompt carefully before clicking accept. OK. Now, I want you to raise your hand again if you think you would have noticed that there is a 0 instead of O in the application's name. OK, this is only 1 out of 4 real-world examples that we are going to present in our talk. But before we start with the attacks, let's start with the threat model.
So we wanted to show you how OAuth applications can be introduced across different stages of the attack chain. As you can see, OAuth applications play an important role across different stages of the attack, from discovery to initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, lateral movement, and finally also in the impact. This explains why understanding the threats OAuth applications introduce is so important. Different defenders will have different visibility into different stages of the attack chain. Email security might see the phishing email that can be sent in the initial access phase. Identity logs can show us the behavior of the application, which can explain to us what the attacker is trying to do. And data logs can show us access to files or mailbox that can show us the impact of the attack. For Sapir and I, there are 3 stages that we wanted to focus in today: initial access, persistence, and privilege escalation. We'll talk about all the techniques attackers can abuse across those stages. But for now, I'll just give you some examples to keep in mind. So in the initial access, attackers can use phishing and send a malicious link and tricking the user into consenting to their malicious application. For the persistence, once a user consents to a malicious application, it will be present in their environment, even if the user resets MFA or changes their password. And for privilege escalation, if the attacker has high enough permissions, they can add their secrets for an existing application and then sign in as the application itself. As I mentioned, we will talk about all of those techniques in our talk, but let's first understand what are OAuth applications.
OK, so now that we understand the threat model, we can set up the agenda for the talk. We will start with some basics, Entra, and OAuth applications 101. Then we will talk about the 4 real-world cases. We will cover 4 types of attacks: malicious application, LoLApps, which we will explain what it is, permissions abuse, and supply chain attacks. We will also share detections and models that we build, and we will share some difficulties that we had along the way. So let's start with some basics. Entra. Entra is Azure's identity provider. It's responsible for manage identities. When I say identities, I mean users, applications, service principals, managed identities, and recently AI agents as well. And when I say manage, I mean configure MFA or conditional access policies, assign roles or API permissions, and it is also responsible for the authentication itself, sign tokens, provide SSO capabilities, etc. An application is a unique object, exists only in one place. in the tenant where it was originally created. But as we know, sometimes applications need to be multi-tenant. To solve this issue, Microsoft uses service principals. Think of a service principal as a local representation of an app inside your specific environment. When you grant consent to an application, you're essentially granting it a visa to enter to your environment and perform activities. This creates a one-to-many relationship. One application exists in one place, and many service principals representing that application across organizations. Now, as the developer of the application, you are responsible for all of the application's properties, such as the name, homepage, logo, and the set of permissions that this application will require for consent. Let's take, for example, the Teams application. The Teams application only exists in Microsoft's tenant. But we all have Teams service principal representing that application in our environments. If you will check the properties of this service principal, you will find a couple of interesting fields. The application ID, which is going to be the same across all the environments. This is the real application ID of the Teams application in Microsoft tenant, and this field binds these two identities together. And also the app owner tenant, which will always be Microsoft's tenant. The field that is going to be different across every environment is the service principal ID, since, as we said, it's unique per your environment.
So let's look at what it looks like to create and consent to an OAuth application in Azure. So the creator of the application just goes to app registrations and choose to register a new application. They can choose any name they want for the app. It's a bit blurry, but trust me, it happens. I think it will fix along the way. They also define the application as a multi-tenant application. And then they define the redirect URI, which is where tokens of the user who will authenticate to the application will be sent to. After they define those properties, they can define other properties as well. For example, they can choose the homepage URL for the application, and they can also choose whichever image they want that will be the logo of their application. And finally, they'll define the application's permissions. The creator of the application can choose between two types of permissions, delegated and application permissions. And those permissions will be requested during the consent process, and they will also be attached to the service principal that will be created from this application.
Okay. When you assign graph permissions to an application, you can choose between two types, delegated and application permissions. Delegated permissions are on behalf of a user, while application permissions are assigned directly to the application. The application authenticates as itself with the credentials the app admin assigned to it and perform activities. Let's take the mail read permission as an example. As you can see, it can be configured as a delegated or as an application permission. As a delegated permission, it only allows you to read the mails of the user that authenticated to the application. But as an application permission, it allows you to read the mails in all the mailboxes, which is much more dangerous. That's why it requires admin consent, as opposed to the delegated permission that only requires the consent of the user that authenticated to the application. We are going to show in this talk how attackers abused both application and delegated permission.
Great. So now let's look at what it looks from the perspective of the user that consent to the application. So here you can see my appless tenant, blurry again. But when I go to the UI of the application and choose to sign in with Microsoft, I get redirected to Microsoft, and then I get this consent page, which is not blurry anymore. This is the most important step in the entire process. You can see the application name, and you can see that the owner of the application is unverified by Microsoft. When I click Accept, a few things will happen. First, the service principal will be created inside my tenant, as Sapir explained before, and the permissions I just approved will be attached to that service principal. We can also see that my token was sent to the reply URL. In this case, it's also printed to the screen. And we can see that the service principal had the permissions to query for the user information. When we go back to my tenant, we can see that the service principal was actually created in my tenant. Great. you can also see that the permissions that I consented to were attached to that service principal, and we can see that their type is delegated permissions, meaning the service principal will only have permissions on behalf of the user that authenticated to the application. So now that we know how this flow works, we wanted to look a little bit about what's getting created behind the scene. So this JSON basically represents service principal object inside Entra ID. It's an identity, and like any other identity, it has properties that we can analyze and monitor. So I'll walk you through key fields that we used as part of this research. So first, we have the application ID and the application owner tenant ID. Both of them are unique to the application. The application ID tells us which application this service principal represents, and the owner tells us who owns the application. We can use the application ID to check how common a specific application is, and we can use the owner to check how many applications a specific owner has. After that, we have the homepage and the display name of the application. Both of them are controlled by the creator of the application, as we saw before. Then we have the reply URL, also controlled by the creator of the application. This reply URL defines where tokens will go after a user will authenticate to the application. So if this points to an attacker-controlled domain, that's not really good for us. And finally, we have the verified publisher. When this field is populated, it means Microsoft has verified the identity of the organization that owns the application. Okay, so we can divide the scenarios in which attackers can abuse OAuth applications into 4, and we will talk about each and every one of them in this talk. First, we have the malicious applications. In this case, the attacker creates the application. They can define its name, they can define its properties, and they can also define the reply URL, so they can define where tokens will go. The attacker can trick a user into consenting to their malicious application through phishing, for example, and this will allow them to gain persistency and privileges inside the user's environment. The second scenario is what we call LoLApps, living off the land with applications. In this case, the application is legitimate. It can be first-party or third-party application. And in this case, the attacker only needs to get the user's password, and then they can consent to that application. This is harder for defenders to detect, because the behavior of the application can be its expected legitimate behavior, but the consent context to the application might be suspicious. The third scenario, again, is legitimate application. In this case, we're talking about applications that have more wider permissions, and the attacker needs to either get the application's secret or add their own secrets to a given application. This will allow them to log in as the application itself, and they won't need a user to consent to any application. This will also allow them much wider and tenant-wide permissions. And the fourth scenario is supply chain attack. In this case, the attacker gets access to the vendor of the application. They don't need a user to consent to the application, and once they have access to the vendor of the application, they can do many things. They can change the application's code, and they can also steal the secrets of the vendor's clients and abusing them. So my main point here is that not all OAuth application abuse look like malicious application phishing. In some scenarios, the application is malicious, but in most scenarios, the application is legitimate. It can have delegated permissions or applications permission, which will be much wider. And in other scenarios, the main interesting part is not the application's identity, but the entry point of the attacker, which might be through the vendor of the application.
OK, now that we know all of this, we can start with the attacks. So the first attack is malicious applications. In this scenario, the attacker creates a malicious application in their own tenant and phish users to authenticate to their malicious application and grant consent to it. Let's take, for example, the attacker created an application, and they chose to name it Teams. Then the attacker phish users to authenticate to their malicious application. Now, two things are going to happen. The first thing is that the access token of the victim will be sent to the reply URL of that application, which the attacker controls. The second thing is that a service principal will be created inside the victim's tenant. Now, this service principal is going to have a couple of interesting fields, and one of the most important one is the app owner tenant, because this field is going to contain the tenant ID of the attacker, and we are going to use it in our detection model. Let's compare these two applications that we found across some organizations. The left one is a legitimate DocuSign application, and the right one is a malicious DocuSign application that our model detected. We will start with the app ID and app owner tenant ID. These are obviously different because these are two different applications with two different owners. The next one is the homepage. In the legitimate application, it's DocuSign.com, and in the malicious application, it's empty. The reply URL of the legitimate application belongs to the DocuSign domain, while in the malicious application, it belongs to MyClickFunnels, which is pretty suspicious. The publisher of the legitimate application is verified as DocuSign, while in the malicious application, the publisher is not verified. And the app owner name, so in the legitimate application, it's DocuSign.com, and in the malicious application, it's just a random company name that has nothing to do with DocuSign. Now, these are clear differences when we look at them, but we wanted to create an automatic model that will detect them for us.
So we just talked about how attackers can abuse malicious OAuth applications. But from a defender's perspective, this creates a very uncomfortable situation, because everything we just talked about is happening through completely legitimate mechanisms. There is no malware or exploit that we can detect, and the malicious application will usually blend in with thousands of other legitimate applications. So we built a pipeline to solve this problem. So after we had our manual hunting phase, we wanted to turn what we learned into something repeatable. The goal was to surface suspicious applications for us to investigate. At a high level, the pipeline does 5 things. First, it extracts application and builds a baseline. Then it enriches each application field. After that, it scores weak signals and uses AI for contextual evaluation. And finally, it pivots between suspicious applications to find campaigns. So let's walk through each and every step here. So the first step is visibility. We ingested applications seen across many environments, mostly third-party applications. And we start by building a baseline. We start by looking at the application ID and application name and checking which applications are more common across tenant. We also looked at application's owner tenant, checking how many applications a given owner has. This is important because common applications are more likely to be legitimate SaaS integrations. They're not automatically safe, but this gives us a reference point. We also extracted the properties that we talked about before. The next stage is enrichment. So we didn't just look at the raw JSON that we showed you before. We also enriched key fields of the application to get more context about each application. We start by looking at the application name and searching for applications that mimicked common application names but have different app ID. We also brought in the context from the previous step, looking at how common a specific application is and how many applications this app owner has. But other than internal data, we also brought in external data. For example, we look at the domain of the homepage and the reply URL and looked at DNS and HTTP properties like name servers, IP resolutions, and connections to other domains. We also used Microsoft Graph Query to query for the owner-tenant ID to get the owner-tenant name and the owner-tenant primary domain. This is the graph query that we use. You can see that we just give it the tenant ID, and we get back the display name of the tenant and the default domain name. Of course, we also encourage you to use it because it gives a lot of context about the owner of the application. So at this stage, we're not detecting malicious applications yet. We're just finding inconsistencies. For example, cases where application claims to be a well-known brand, but its owner domain is unrelated, might be something suspicious we'll want to investigate. The third stage is decision. the most important thing here is that we didn't rely on only one indicator. An unverified publisher on its own is not enough to determine that an application is malicious. But when you look at a combination of several indicators, like suspicious URL, unrelated publisher, empty homepage, and low prevalence, you get a much stronger signal. We also built a weighted scoring mechanism to prioritize applications for investigation.
OK, so at this point, we have a model that can surface suspicious applications for us. This is a real malicious Adobe application that our model surfaced. Now, Shahar and I had to do some manual contextual checks. For example, the reply URL. Does it make sense? Does it look suspicious? Sometimes the app homepage wasn't empty, so we Google it. The app owner domain, so is this even a real company? Does it make sense that this company is the owner of that application? And all of these manual checks prevented our model from becoming autonomous and scalable. So we realized we are missing something. Do you want to guess what it is? Because I'm a bit scared to say it here. It's AI, yeah. OK, so by combining AI in our model, we were able to complete the contextual part without doing the manual tests. And then we could finish our model.
Great. So the final part, once we have suspicious applications, is understanding whether those applications are isolated or part of a campaign. So we have the malicious OAuth application, and we obviously know the app owner ID. And because, as we explained before, the owner ID, the owner tenant is controlled by the attacker, any other application created from that tenant will likely be malicious as well. But we can also extract the reply URL and owner domain and pivot on shared indicators to find connections to other domains. Those domains can be the reply URL or homepage of other OAuth applications, and they can also be the domains of other owner tenants, and from there we can get to other malicious applications. Let's look at a really simple example. This is a real-world application that our pipeline surfaced, and this is its app owner domain. We also saw that this app owner owns 3 distinct other malicious applications that we determined were malicious, and from there we managed to surface other victims and alert to them as well.
So to conclude this part, we wrote a model that collects every application in every organization and alerts to customers with high confidence and high severity that they authenticated or granted consent to a malicious application. And we are very proud of ourselves that it worked.
Wow, OK. Thank you. OK, so after we had the pipeline, we ran it across a real-world environment of our clients. And the results are documented in our blog post. So I won't walk you through each and every value. You can check it out yourself, recommended. But I'll just walk through some interesting parts of it. So first of all, we discovered 90 distinct OAuth applications just in the past year that were part of at least 3 distinct OAuth applications campaign. I would also mention that we discovered those applications across dozens of environments, so it's not just one environment that was impacted. Another interesting part is the connections between the IOCs. So we talked about it before, but we saw that many applications share the same owner tenant. Here we can see an example from the blog post. Those 2 applications had the same owner tenant ID. In other cases, we saw that several applications use the legitimate SaaS platform named MyClickFunnels as their domain in the reply URL, which was also very interesting, another example. And we also saw that many of the applications were mimicking names of common brands. So this is why we added that as part of our pipeline. I mentioned that before. OK, so one thing that is interesting to look at is the comparison between the campaigns over the year. We will start with application name. As you can see, in the older campaigns, the attacker chose application names that mimics Microsoft first-party applications. But since you can't really create an application with the exact same name of a Microsoft first-party application, I tried
don't let you. So the attackers had to use typo squatting. And that's why, I don't know if you're noticing, there is a Cyrillic R in the SharePoint, and we saw the 0 instead of O. And comparing to the 2025 campaign, where the attackers just chose name of a common third-party vendors, which is allowed, and that made their application names look more legitimate. And the reply URL is also interesting. As you can see in the older campaigns, the attacker actually tried to make the reply URL look legitimate. They even owned that domain, which is pretty interesting. Comparing to the 2025 campaign, well, it looks like the attacker didn't really care what the reply URL looks like. There is a possibility that these are just 3 distinct attackers, that some of them are more sophisticated than the others. But it doesn't really matter, because all of them succeeded in their mission. So, OK, before we will move forward to the next attack, there is one thing we wanted to highlight: community. Sharing IOCs is important for us to grow as a community and improve our detection capabilities. In our blog post, you can find all of the malicious application IDs and all of the malicious app owner tenant IDs that we found. And we've also seen some great resources online that summarize similar write-ups. So we really encourage you to check them out and make sure you're actively monitoring for all of them. OK, congratulations. Survived our first attack. And now we can move forward to the next one, which is LoLApps. So you probably heard about the term living off the land before, maybe in a different context. In Windows, for example, attackers use OS built-in tools, like certutils, for example, instead of bringing their own malware. So this is our cloud equivalent. Instead of creating their own malicious application, which security products will most likely detect, attackers find legitimate existing applications that requires the exact set of permissions that they need to perform the attack, and use that instead. There are 2 types of LoLApps: third-party applications and Microsoft first-party applications. Now, it's important to say, this concept is not close to being new. It exists since Azure existed, basically. But we just had to think about a name for like the title of this part of the talk. So we came up with LoLApps. You don't have to use it if you don't want. OK, so we'll start with the third-party applications. We wanted to give a huge credit to Huntress, which created this really cool repository that currently tracks down 7 known LoLApps. For each LoLApp, they present 2 important things: the set of permission that this application requires, and how attackers abuse it. So interesting example. Actually, this morning, we saw an attacker abusing rclone, but it was in a AWS. And I'm not sure I can say AWS in this room, so move forward. Let's take, for example, SIG parser. So again, SIG parser is a completely legitimate application. You can see the permissions that this application requires. These are delegated permissions. We have calendars, contacts, mails, and user basic information. And attackers abuse it by collecting contacts and recent recipients to create a more targeted phishing attack. Now, this is the SIG parser sign-in page. Attackers just choose to sign in with Microsoft, and then they use user stolen credentials to authenticate, and they grant the consent to the SIG parser application. You can see here in the consent prompt the exact set of permissions that we saw in the Huntress website. Now, for the security teams, it would look like the user just authenticated to a completely legitimate application, which makes it much harder to detect. But even though third-party applications are a great opportunity for attackers, not every organization accepts them, and they don't always give the attacker the set of permissions that they need for the attack. So the logical question is, why to even look outside? What if you can live off the land with legitimate, pre-consented application that exists in every tenant on Earth? I'm obviously speaking about Microsoft first-party applications. So Microsoft first-party applications are being abused since ever. I chose, as an example, the application that, from what I'm seeing in the recent months, is being abused the most, Microsoft Azure CLI. So Microsoft Azure CLI allows you to authenticate using the CLI and perform basically every activity, from listing all the users to listing all the secrets in a key vault. But if I'm being honest, Microsoft Azure CLI is far from being the only Microsoft first-party application that is being abused. So I wanted to take this moment and make sure you are all familiar with the Entroscopes project, which was created by Dirk-Jan and Fabian. This project summarizes all the Microsoft first-party applications. For each application, they present a couple of interesting things, if it's forky or non-forky, if it's vulnerable to a consent fix attack, and also the different scopes that you get when you authenticate with different resources. If we will go back to our example, Microsoft Azure CLI, so first of all, unrelated, you can see it is vulnerable to a conditional access policy bypass when authenticating with the Microsoft Intune check-in resource. And you can see some of the scopes that you get when authenticating with Microsoft Graph, for example, and you can see all of them if you would scroll down. So with third-party LoLApps, attackers usually use stolen credentials. They authenticate and then exfiltrate data in a stealthier way. But with Microsoft first-party applications, the situation is a bit different. Since many of the Microsoft first-party application supports multiple authentication mechanisms, so the more the authentication mechanisms, the more ways you have to steal a user's access token. And from what we are seeing with Microsoft first-party applications, they usually use phishing. And not any phishing, specifically device code phishing. So just to make sure we are all familiar with the device code flow, this is a completely legitimate authentication mechanism. So the goal is to allow you to authenticate from a device that doesn't have a keyboard or a browser. For example, when you configure Netflix on your smart TV, so you usually scan a QR with your phone or enter the code. This is exactly it. So the device asks Microsoft to generate a code. Then the user takes this code and performs the authentication using the code from their own machine with the keyboard and the browser. If the user needs to complete MFA, they complete it. If they need to grant consent, they grant it. And then the access token of the user will be sent back to the device that originally asked for the code. Now, I'm sure all of you already understood how this mechanism can be abused. But just to make sure, let's talk about device code phishing. The attacker from their device asks Microsoft to generate a code. Then they send a phishing mail to the victim, ask them to authenticate to Azure using the code. The victim performs the authentication, completes the MFA, grants the consent. Then the access token of the user, which is the victim, will be sent back to the device that originally asked for the code, which is the attacker's machine. So, detections. There are multiple ways to detect LoLApps abuse. And we are not going to describe how to detect Microsoft first-party abuse, because we believe it deserves at least a 45 minutes dedicated talk. So we will only describe how we think you should detect third-party LoLApps abuse. So basically, there are two things you should have in mind. First of all, there are only 7 known LoLApps that have been seen abused in the wild. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is the application itself. Is it even common in my organization? If no one ever used a SIG parser before and suddenly one user starts to, this is something to have in mind. The second and more important thing is the authentication itself. Does the authentication itself look suspicious? It can be the user agent, the IP, the location. This is already a second red flag. And combining these two together, you create a reliable detection.
OK, so we talked about malicious applications. We talked about LoLApps. But in both of those cases, attackers will usually abuse applications with delegated permissions. Now we wanted to focus on cases where attackers will abuse applications with applications permissions, which can be tenant-wide and give the attacker much more power. So let's talk about how attackers are doing that. So first, we'll start with the basics. So each application has 2 parts. First, the permissions that defines what the application can access. And second is the credentials that define how the application can prove its identity. When attacker abuses OAuth application, they usually care about both parts. They want high permissions, and they want a way to abuse them. There are 2 ways that we haven't talked about that explain how attackers can abuse permissions and credentials of an application. The first one is stealing credential. Sounds simple, but it's not that simple. The attacker needs to get the application secret. There are many techniques to do that. For example, the secrets can be leaked to GitHub, and attackers can achieve that secret through abusing GitHub, which we saw recently in many attacks. Once they have that secret, they can log in as the application itself, and they don't need any user to authenticate to the application. The other scenario is to add credential to a given application. In this case, the attacker already has access to the tenant, and they need high enough permissions that will allow them to add their own secret to a given application. And once they have that, they can come back whenever they want and authenticate as the application, and they will also have the application's permissions. So when we talk about those kinds of abuse, we always talk about legitimate applications. So all of the properties that we talked about before will be legitimate here. There won't be any suspicious reply URL, and the owner of the application will be legitimate as well. So there are three things we wanted to focus on when we trying to discover abuse of those kind of legitimate applications. First is resources. What the application usually touches, which users, mailboxes, files the application usually access. If the same applications usually touches only one user, but one shiny day it starts touching all of the users in the environment, that is something suspicious that is worth investigating. The second thing is volume. So here we talk about how many actions a specific service principal is doing at a given set of time. If I have a mailbox integration that usually just read one mailbox in one day, but suddenly starts to read every mailbox in the organization, again, something suspicious here. And finally, execution context. So when an attacker will sign in to the application from their own infrastructure, the context of the sign-in will be different than when the application will do that. The attacker might do that from a VPN, or they can sign in from a different country. Sometimes they will use a different user agent, or will do that at an unexpected time. So in order to detect those kind of abuses, we again created a pipeline, not surprising. So we start by baselining the behavior of the service principals. We didn't baseline the behavior of all the service principals that we see, because there are many service principals that behave in an unexpected or non-consistent way. But when we have a service principal that behave in a consistent way, every deviation from that baseline will be much more important. So after we created that baseline, we flattened the results. Flattening is important because the raw fields could be noisy. For example, if the version of the user agent might change, that doesn't necessarily mean that the client behind the application had changed as well. Once we have the baseline, we started checking for anomalies from that baseline. We looked at authentication from a new VPN, a new country, a new user agent family, access to new resources, and spike in volume activity. And now, Sapir will talk about how we use this pipeline to detect a real-world threat actor.
OK, so for the most interesting part of this research, the results. So using our model, we were able to detect a pretty sophisticated attacker. But unfortunately, we can't describe all of the activities the attacker performed, and we will only focus on activities that triggered our model. So the attacker compromised a pretty powerful service principal, one that can read all the emails in the organization. Then they authenticated as that service principal from a commercial VPN, and using a custom tool written in Go, they exfiltrated all the emails of the organization. They did it by creating a huge amount of requests to the Graph API, so the Microsoft Graph resource. This activity lit up our model like a Christmas tree. Okay? It didn't just got the required threshold to trigger an alert. It actually got the highest possible score because everything was anomalous regarding to the baseline of that application. the VPN usage, the Go user agent, the Microsoft Graph resource, and the amount of requests that they did in a very short range of time. But it's not always that nice and easy, and we wanted to share some difficulties we have with our model. As you know, baseline-based detections are not always that fun. So some of our fun false positives. The first one, security products. This is a complete nightmare. Security products can act like a full-time attacker. They do massive scans, and they can act very anomalous according to their baseline. So we have this one. The second one is debugging. Although curl is heavily used by attackers, it is also used by developers when they debug their applications. And since developers don't debug their applications every day, the activity is pretty anomalous to the application's baseline. And the last one, chaos. Not every application plays nice. Some applications do whatever they want, whenever they want, which is the worst possible thing for a baseline-based detection. There is no good solution to these problems. We just had to find a kind of a sweet spot where we can give enough attention to every alert we see, but we are also aware that some of these alerts are just developers doing their jobs. Now for our last attack, supply chain. So if you are a security practitioner and you've been living on planet Earth in the recent year, I'm pretty sure you saw this. And if not, then this. And if not, then this. And if not, don't worry. I'm pretty sure you know this one, OK? Pretty sure. But if not, GitHub supply chain attacks are the hot topic of the year. Attackers poison packages, NPM packages, or other packages. Developers install those packages, and by doing so, they install malware. Now, this is a heavily focused Azure talk. You're Team Azure. I'm obviously Team Azure as well. So why am I standing here speaking about GitHub supply chain attacks? This is because the line between your code and your cloud is about to vanish. I'm going to show you 3 screenshots of the recent TeamPCP malware. These are screenshots that I took from the real TeamPCP malware, which we call Azure Collector. The first one tries to collect cached credentials from the Azure CLI cache. The second one tries to request a managed identity access token from the IMDS service. And the last one, my favorite, tries to search in the environment variables Azure application secrets and certificates. So not related to Azure, right? So we will end this talk by asking a very important question we think every security practitioner needs to be thinking about. Who is it going to be next? Throughout this entire talk, we looked at OAuth application abuses as isolated pieces. But the reality is that Azure applications are being abused everywhere and all the time. If you look at the recent TeamPCP malware, you will see that when the attackers poisoned those packages, they weren't just looking to drop a standard malware. They were systematically hunting for Azure applications credentials. And we can tell you that based on the amount of secrets exfiltrated in those campaigns, we are absolutely certain that cross-tenant supply chain attacks and massive OAuth application abuses are going to be even more common than ever. So the infrastructure is already compromised. We definitely know it. The only question left is which organization's application they will use next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? We do have plenty of time for questions, so you were worried without any reason.
Great talk. Thank you very much. On the last point about kind of supply chain attacks, obviously, yeah, they're like a huge deal right now. And it seems part of the problem is because, they're not necessarily kind of strictly the vendor's fault. But I guess, do you have any opinions about either as a community or as like things that the vendors can be doing to kind of help close off this gap?
I think it's more related to like the code parts of the security world, which we are not very experts in. I think like the basics, I think there are multiple security products today that warns you where you put like hard-coded credentials and stuff like that on GitHub, which was like attackers find them and use them. We're seeing it. But to be honest, I think it's like protect your application servers, because that's how it works. That's where they steal it, or from the developers' endpoints that install the packages. And I think now, after the recent supply chain attacks, a lot of security companies trying to find methods to find these malicious NPM packages before everyone installs them. And I think it's like we're getting closer. I see that now not only Wiz, but also other security companies knows how to detect these applications, the packages the moment that they are being shipped. But still, I wouldn't say there is like a good solution here, and it feels like maybe the next startup. I don't know, because yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Then
Thank you.
Thank
there
you.
will be a round.
Oh.
Thank you, guys. Round of applause.
I'll do it.